1997 with the election of Tony Blair, where there were 120, and it's now fallen right down again. Do you know what the numbers are? No, but I mean it's certainly less than 100. So, the aristocratic Conservative Party in many ways returns to power. It puts up the coronation is a big show. It's very, very redolent of the old imperial order. The empire had been completely absent in the Festival of Britain. All the great heads of the colonies come to celebrate the coronation. And you have in the 1950s high society, the world of high society, of aristocratic high society, suddenly becoming fashionable. Okay? Suddenly you have fashion pages in the newspapers where the new fashions are modelled by the aristocratic debutantes coming of age at their balls. You have increasing visibility of the great events of high society, of the aristocratic season, the horse racing at Ascot, the royal box at Wimbledon, and you have these very increasing sort of Anglo-American connections between American money and British aristocratic blood through the Astors, the Cunards, and of course our old friend Mrs. Simpson. Okay? So the question that I'm really trying to get at is how is it that this party that remains aristocratic presides over this social democratic experiment, and doesn't just preside over it, but wins 3 straight elections over the Labour Party? And the answer is the British Housewives League. No, I'm joking. 1945, there's this organisation called the British Housewives League set up. And the British Housewives League is there basically to try and, as a protest against continuing state involvement in people's lives after the war. I'll read you out one of its aims, is to show that the over-control by the state is not in the interest of a free and happy home life and the development of personality in accord with the Christian tradition. Okay, that gives you a good flavour of it. And what they call for was basically the abolition of rationing, the abolition of government controls that were so central to the structures of most housewives' lives. So there's an important strand of anti-statism that is there throughout the 1940s that the British Housewives League represents. The Conservative Party come along in 1950, 1951, and they pick this up. Their election slogan is "Set the people free." Set the people free. That means not a return to free market economics, but a retreat from the overbearing technocratic state where the experts are telling people what they can and cannot do. So the first thing that they work towards is the end of rationing. Food rationing ends in 1954 and then clothes and furniture in 1958. And consumer expenditure gradually rises. I mean, that's in a way one of the big stories of today's lecture. Between 1952 and 1964, consumer expenditure rose by 45%. And much of that was on non-essential items because the cost of food was slowly decreasing. It had occupied about 30% of most working class budgets, and by the early 1960s that was down to 20%. The other key thing that they did, of course, was to deliver on housing, okay, to promise that they were going to build more houses than the Labour Party. And so they made this big pledge to build 100,000 more houses a year than the Labour Party had managed. Now remember, that's public housing they're building, it's projects they're building. But they hold out the dream of the property owning democracy, of people being able to own their own homes. Okay, very important. Only 20% of the there was only 20% of the housing stock was occupied by owners in 1947. That slowly increases quite through the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s. And the last thing that they do, as anyone who wants to shrink the state does, is reduce levels of taxation. Clearly, this new system required an important amount of public funds that came through tax contributions, and the Conservatives reduced that by about 10% between 1945 and 1959. And you can see in this election poster, Q's controls rationing. Don't let this happen again, vote Conservative. That's from 55. So that model of that, you know, of Q's controls rationing, experts in your life, you know, that's what they're campaigning against. That's the mood that they get. Now, it is a remarkable achievement between 1951 and 1978 in terms of what the British economy delivers. Okay, and I'm emphasizing that these dates are 1951 to 1978. Okay, the Conservatives come out of power in 1964. They're re-elected again on and off through the 70s. GDP growth just under 3%. Unemployment, remember the pledge to unemployment, delivered, effectively delivered. Unemployment at around 2%. Infant mortality, that great measure of standards of living, cut in half. And you can see the rise of home ownership from 30 to 50%. And in people's homes, the new commodities that made domestic life so much more bearable. The growth of washing machines from just about 7% to 67%. Fridges, 3% in 1951 up to 68%. And televisions going from 2 to 90%. Okay, now, it's important to emphasize that this isn't just the achievement of the Conservative government. In fact, this economic policy was described as Butskillism. After Hugh Gaitskell, the Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer between 1945 and 51, and Rab Butler, the Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer. And both of them were basically following more or less the same policies, and they were doing it, this was achieved, remember, in the context of the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War, funded in part, of course, by the Marshall Plan and by American dollars. So there's a general process here, and we're just seeing the British manifestation of it. And as I said, what this demonstrates is the way in which government was increasingly held responsible for the achievement of economic growth. We're not back in the old free market world of the up until the 1930s, when governments were often not held responsible for the rise and fall of the economy. Now, governments were held responsible for managing the economy to deliver these improved standards of living. And there's a whole series of new economic statistics that began to be delivered in the 1950s and 1960s that enabled people to map the degree of the effectiveness of that economic management. So standards of living was measured through a retail price index and by wage standards, new measures of industrial productivity and productivity rates, that's output per man hour. All of these are new types of economic data that hadn't existed before. Okay? A new way of conceiving of the economy. And likewise, you get a set of comparative world economic data that exists for the first time, that comes out of organizations like the United Nations and the EEC and the Marshall Plan in the early 1950s. Measures of GMP, shares of world trade, and critically in the UK context of international productivity rates. Okay? This is all going to be hugely important because it's this statistical data with which governments are held accountable for how effectively they have improved the standard of living And as you can see, which you've read online, Harold Macmillan, as he comes in after the Suez Crisis in 1956 and becomes Prime Minister, makes this very famous thing claiming that how the Conservative governments had transformed the country. Most of our people have never had it so good. Go around the country and you'll see a state of prosperity such as which we've never had in my lifetime, nor indeed in the history of this country. Okay? A very dramatic statement. And Macmillan, by the way, had been one of the people involved in political and economic planning in the 1930s. An aristocrat, but someone very interested in economic management. So everything seems rosy in the garden. Okay? However, those international economic statistics also told another story. It was a story of basically Britain seemingly falling behind its economic competitors, having the lowest GDP rate in Europe, for instance, mapping the collapse of exports between its share of world. I can't believe that's a very bad thing. That is figures for the share of world exports, of the world export market, which falls from 25 to 10%, and struggling increasingly with a balance of payments deficit that puts the sterling, the pound sterling, which remember is organized in this thing called the sterling area, as a bolster against the new world currency of the dollar, into a series of crises. And the devaluation of the pound in 1949 and then again in 1967 to try and address the increasing balance of payments deficit. Now, when the Conservatives were emphasizing all the time the rise of personal consumption and the improvement in the standard of living, the Labour Party increasingly latched on to this comparative economic data to say that Britain was falling behind. It was becoming internationally uncompetitive, and it was needed to be modernized. And so one of the central features of the Labour's campaigns in 1959 and 1964 was to project a completely new type of image for a new type of Britain, to modernize and make Britain fit for the challenges of the international economy. And it's under that manifesto that Harold Wilson in 1964, promising that he's going to transform Britain with a white heat of technology, gets re-elected, and the Conservative Party finally go back to being the opposition. Any questions on any of that stuff? Yeah. Right. Right. So the question for those of you over there struggling with the construction work out here is, did anyone care that in this sort of hyper-masculine world that it's a queen that is installed in 1953 in the coronation ceremony? And in a way, you should have answered your own question, because the precedent had been so important. In many ways, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II constantly evoked not Queen Victoria, which you'd think would be the obvious parallel, but Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I in the 17th century, who had been the figure that had in a way started Britain's great age of prosperity and of imperial expansion. You know, it was Queen Elizabeth. They even called it a new Elizabethan age, and so there was a hearkening back to that model of a powerful woman on the throne who would, transform the country. Having said that,